Just wanted to briefly go over the agenda for this particular session of slides. We're going to talk about research problems, purpose statements, questions, and then look ahead. But I wanted to touch on also the Bracey articles. While you were reading the Bracey articles, I wanted you to understand that the Bracey wasn't trying to completely turn you off from research, and that was not the intention of me having you read those. I wanted you to read those so that you could take note of how to be a good consumer of the research, how to dig into the research to make sure that what you were reading was actually what was found in the research. The nice thing about educational research is that peer-reviewed journals will help with the types of issues that Bracey brought up. Peer-reviewed journals in education search, or to think that everything you're reading is. As we talk about research as scientific inquiry, I just want to point out why we do research. The reasons for research are to either describe phenomena, which you will often find in qualitative studies, so explain something that is happening within education, or to examine empirical relationships between or among phenomena, which you may see in some quantitative or qualitative studies, and then last, to test whether or not these relationships are causal. And those types of research questions will appear in quantitative studies. So we do our research for very specific reasons, and the way to get at those reasons is going to be different depending on whether it's a quantitative or qualitative study. When we're talking about scientific inquiry, we're talking about how we research. And as you look at the research that you are reading, you should notice that there is a natural progression between the introduction and the research questions, the data collection, the data analysis. From the very beginning, we should see questions that are phrased in such a way that can be investigated, that can be researched. And then we should see a literature review that connects those questions to the existing literature that has already been researched. Finally, we should see a connection to the methodology. So whatever our question is, it should be a logical progression to the methods section. If we're asking about how people feel, then we should see some sort of qualitative measure as opposed to a quantitative measure, perhaps, if that's what we are wanting to know. Ultimately, you want a clear chain from the research question to the existing literature to the methodology and the data collection. After everything has been collected, it's also very important that studies can be replicated and generalized, and that the information we need to do so is contained within the research. We may not be able to generalize to all populations or to all content areas, but we need to know how to generalize different types of research papers. So I just wanted to point out on the next two slides the differences between quantitative and qualitative studies. You'll see these differences in the introduction first, because in a quantitative study you'll have more specific research questions. And remember, quantitative is numbers. And in qualitative research you'll see more general problem statements in that introduction. Same thing with the review of the literature. Quantitative tends to be a little bit longer initially, whereas qualitative is a little bit more brief. And by brief, I don't mean a couple paragraphs, but it's not as long as a quantitative study. But what you will see is that when you start to get to the results section, those qualitative studies are much longer because the research comes back into play at that point. So you end up with a more lengthy discussion about how the findings tie back into the research, whereas quantitative studies, you see that on the front end. Again, you'll see the differences between quantitative and qualitative studies with research problems and questions. Quantitative is more specific and narrow. You have your independent and dependent variables very clearly defined because you know what you're going to be measuring, whereas with qualitative questions it may be more broad as you're trying to understand perspectives or trying to understand interactions. So you may not have your variables as clearly defined because you are being guided by the data collection process. This is a nice way of thinking about the entire process. So we're going to go from the top down to the very general to more specific. you're going to start with your topic. I've asked all of you already to decide on your topic, so you have that top box done. And when you're looking for research articles, that's what you're plugging in as your keywords. Those are your topic areas. As you go down further, you come to a research problem. So if I'm interested in distance learning, what is the problem? The problem is there's not enough students within these long distance classes. At this point, this is where the literature comes into play. This is when a research article will start pulling in the research from previous years in order to make a case for why they are now doing the research. So your literature and your research problem should present some sort of hole in the research. So if I see that no one else is studying why there aren't enough students, or I can't figure out in the research why students aren't going to community colleges specifically, then that then becomes my purpose. I'm not going to research something that I can already find the answer to. So my purpose statement becomes, I'm going to study why students don't attend distance education classes at a community college. And then I get even more specific, because what exactly do I want to know? I want to know, does the use of website technology in the classroom deter students from enrolling in distance education? And I might piggyback on that to say, at community colleges. So I've gone from a very broad topic and I've whittled it down to this very specific research question. And as you read research articles, you will see the same thing, and you'll see that integration of the literature that really focuses the reader on what is missing in the literature and why the purpose and the research question that's being outlined. And a research problem focuses the reader on what the study is going to be about, and it also identifies the need, the hole within the research, and explains why the particular research study is being conducted. So it really does just primarily focus the reader on what to expect. Looking at the findings from a study, it may be that they want to extend the study. It may be that they want to use different subjects to see if the study is still valid with different subjects. So if I did a study on freshman high school students, would the same information, would the same results apply to senior high school students? So maybe a replication. It could be that things change over time as Common Core comes into play. Are certain math interventions still as effective under new standards? Or maybe we try different methodologies. If we know that reading fluency programs yield these results, can I change the way that I deliver the instruction for fluency and still get the same results? It may also come out of just a researcher's interest, something that they think is interesting and there isn't a lot of research about a topic. Or maybe it's an application of a theory. You have a theory about why teachers are leaving the field and you want to test that theory out. So all of those ways are part of the development of a research problem from the perspective of a researcher. This gives you an outline of some of the research problems that you may see in the literature. The first is a very general research problem. It talks about the purpose of the study being to investigate the attitudes of high school students with mandated drug testing programs. What this doesn't tell us is exactly what types of attitudes we're looking at and the population that we're going to be working with. So if you look even more specifically, you'll see that there are specific statements and questions, and the first one really looks at the attitude differences between males and females, and then the second one looks at the different age groups. So those are more specific than that general question in the beginning. You want to be specific with your population so that the reader knows exactly who the study could be generalized to, and as you're reading the research, you also want that information so that you know if it's applicable to your own setting. It's important to differentiate between researchable and non-researchable problems. Researchable problems obviously are ones that can be answered. So what are the achievement and social skill differences between children attending an academically or socially oriented preschool program, or what is the relationship between teachers' knowledge of assessment methods and their use of them? We could figure out ways to assess both of these. The first one with the achievement and social skill differences, we could do some sort of math achievement, reading achievement, or look at both of them. We could do some sort of social skill rating scale, which could be completed by teachers or parents. And for the second, the relationship between teachers' knowledge of assessments and their use, to actually do some sort of assessment of what teachers know, and then to look at their lesson plans to say what are they using. So we could measure both of these. Non-researchable problems are usually too vague, they are value-based, or they don't have a question that can be easily answered. For example, is democracy a good form of government? With this question, according to who? Who would decide that? How do we define good? So that would not be researchable. Should values clarification be taught in public school? Should it? Who decides whether it should or it shouldn't? So we can't really research that either. Can crime be prevented? Should physical education classes be dropped from high school curriculum? So anything that starts with should is probably not going to be something that's researchable. So it's important to make sure when you're reading research that you don't start with a question like this, and when you're devising your own, that you're also moving away from these types of questions. You want to make sure that you could be concrete in the way that you could actually find the answer to these questions. The very nature of quantitative and qualitative research really lays out how research problems are phrased. So quantitative is much more specific and closed, and it's outcome oriented, so you're looking at comparisons between two data points in your data analysis, whereas with qualitative it's going to be more general or open because you're looking to solve some sort of process oriented or evolving issue that you are trying to discover the answer for. So just be aware that the research problems are going to look different depending on the type of research you're reading. When you're looking at quantitative research problems, you're going to see three main components within the questions. First, you'll see the research design. That will either be experimental or quasi-experimental. Experimental research designs use randomization, whereas the quasi-experimentals don't. So it'll start out by saying, this quasi-experimental research study will examine, and then it'll talk about the variables of interest. The Walker reading program on reading fluency. So it's going to look at the two variables, the reading program and the reading fluency, and it'll also talk about the subjects of third graders in a suburban school district. So it's going to lay out each of those components for you so you know exactly what type of study it is, what variables are going to be compared, and with whom. The purpose of a qualitative research problem will be to either identify some sort of issue or processes that's going to be investigated. For example, the research study may say that it's going to examine drug abuse in high schools and then lay out further what they're trying to learn about, or looking at the issue of teacher burnout. It could also be the processes, how teachers change to standards-based curricula, or how students incorporate expectations into their studies. So both of these are okay, but they're not going to be as specific as a quantitative research problem. This provides you an overview of what you'll see with a qualitative research problem. Typically they are open-ended in nature, they're very general, and sometimes they do evolve as the data is collected, because you may start with a pretty broad hypothesis, and based on the information you're getting, that may guide you towards theory, so the research problem may continue to change and grow as the data is collected and analyzed. After the purpose has been outlined, the authors will provide additional focus through the hypothesis statement. And what this is going to outline for you is what relationship is expected to be found between two variables. Or it may allow the investigator or the researcher to confirm or not confirm relationships between variables. It may also just provide a framework for explaining the results and drawing conclusions from those things. So you'll be able to see as you start reading the research that researchers will say, we expect to find X, Y, and Z through this research, or it is anticipated that this research will tell us, and then they'll lay it out in that format. Researchers also use hypotheses to guide their research study. The hypothesis statement is going to give the researchers the variables that are going to be used within the study, as well as